The clock is ticking for cities and towns to rezone areas surrounding MBTA stations to make room for more multifamily housing. That's through the MBTA Communities Act, which passed in 2021 to increase affordable housing and encourage the use of public transit. The first deadline is coming up. All cities and towns connected to the subway have until the end of this year to comply. But in many of these communities, the process has been complicated and contentious. That includes Brookline, where my next guest, town meeting member and former Assistant Secretary of Transportation, Chris Dempsey, is part of a working group on a compromise. Chris, thanks so much for being here today.
Great to be with you.
So I want to start off by asking you to give us a lay of the land. Where does Brookline stand right now toward complying with the MBTA Communities Act?
Yeah, so as you said, because Brookline is an inner core community with subway service, it has to comply with this act before many of the other communities across Massachusetts. There are 177 cities and towns that must change their zoning or have zoning that reflects the goals of this act. Brookline is one of a handful that has to do it this year. Most communities will have to do it by the end of next year.
So what happens if the Brookline does not comply? I know that the Attorney General has threatened to sue jurisdictions that don't comply. We have a quote from her where she said, quote, "Compliance with the MBTA community's zoning law is not only mandatory, it is an essential tool for the Commonwealth to address its housing crisis along with our climate and transportation goals." So what's at stake here for Brookline if town meeting doesn't meet the deadline?
Yeah, well, look, I think that Attorney General Campbell should be applauded for being clear that she believes that this is not a choice that cities and towns have, that it is a requirement of the law. I think she's right, and it's important that she's saying that, because what it does is it puts a little bit of friendly pressure on a community like Brookline, who I think voted for Attorney General Campbell something like 80-20, right, in the last election. So many people in Brookline really like her, and she's saying, you guys got to do a little bit better on housing. If somehow we got to the end of this calendar year and we did not have compliant zoning, and we don't have that today, so we have action that we need to take between now and then we would be opened up to all sorts of lawsuits, whether it would be from the Attorney General herself or others who would say, look, Brookline is no longer in compliance. It's not in compliance with this act, and it has an obligation and a requirement to do so. In that case, you could see that a judge might actually step in and write the zoning code for Brookline, which would be very unusual, but is a potential outcome of us not being in compliance. So again, it's some friendly or maybe even unfriendly pressure to make sure that the town is living up to the obligations of this act.
So you're one of the first towns to be potentially complying with the law. Others have. Lexington, for example, passed its reforms earlier this year. But have you guys been looking at other towns to see models of potentially how to comply with the MBTA Communities Act, models that you thought were good, or are you kind of charting your own path?
Yeah, and I think bravo to Lexington for getting out ahead. They passed their zoning more than a year ahead of when they were required to do it. They created real compromise across different constituencies in their town meeting. And Brookline is trying to undergo that same process. You know, one way that Brookline is somewhat unique is that for an inner core community, it is still a town form of government, just as Milton is. Every other community in that inner core is a city, and so their zoning has to be approved by a city council. In our case, it's town meeting. We have over 250 town meeting members who are elected in their neighborhoods. It's a very messy, small d democratic form of government. We don't always agree. We have loud and noisy debates on the floor of town meeting. But often what you see is that different groups and people can come together to forge some compromise. And the latest plan that is on the table right now that is being described as the consensus plan, which doesn't mean everybody agrees, but which is agreed to by the majority of the select board and by the planning department and others in town, would be to do rezoning in existing multifamily districts, to add in some new land that is owned by the Brookline Housing Authority that would allow them to create more public housing, which is great, and then to also rezone the corridor of Harvard Street, which is the main commercial corridor that kind of goes north-south in the town. It's where the 66 bus runs, one of the busiest bus lines in Greater Boston, and is served by the D line and the C line. And even the B line. So this is a corridor that is in need of attention, that is a jewel of our community, but could be improved through reform of zoning, and that's what we're hoping to do.
So obviously there are a lot of strong feelings about housing whenever it comes up in a community. One of the arguments that opponents have raised throughout this process, especially when the planning board submitted their first idea, a rough idea of what they think that should be rezoned around Harvard Street, was there was concern about commercial spaces and whether or not there would be enough commercial space saved for that. So how would that plan ensure that that concern is actually addressed?
So the original regulations that were promulgated by the state said that cities and towns could not require first floor commercial. They could allow it to happen, but they couldn't make it a requirement of this zoning. And just in August, the state updated those regulations or those guidelines and indicated that, in fact, cities and towns like Brookline could require commercial on the first floor. That change has seemed to win over some of the opponents of the initial proposal, who were concerned that little small business owners would be displaced and instead luxury housing would come in. And so it's been great for Brookline that change happened. We want a mixed-use, vibrant, walkable community. And what I say to my friends in Brookline who are opposed to any change, any zoning reform, is that really that's what makes Brookline so great, is that it is transit-oriented, it is walkable, that it has a diversity of housing, and it has a diversity of things that you can do in the community. And while Brookline, I think, is very special in that, it is by no means unique in Massachusetts. What this legislation is trying to do across eastern Massachusetts is take advantage of the fact that so many of our communities were built around downtowns that had transit service and that grew in a walkable way, where you could get on a train and get into Boston. Starting in the 1940s until just recently, we've really encouraged more sprawling development, where you might live in a home that you can only access with a car and you can't walk downtown. And while that's great for some people, it's really bad when we're looking at reducing housing costs, when we're looking at reducing the miles that people have to drive to get access to a job or to school. You look at local air pollution that's caused by all that driving. And so we're trying to return to, in many ways, what has made Massachusetts so special and New England so special, that those walkable downtowns that are transit-oriented.
Well, I did want to ask you about that because you like your history and you were Assistant Secretary of Transportation and know a lot about the Commonwealth's history. So, Brookline has a rich history of being a streetcar suburb. Yep. Housing and development is always scary for a lot of folks, not for any sinister reason, but change is hard. Sure. How does the MBTA Communities Act and complying with this law, how does it fall into that history of Brookline being a dense streetcar suburb of Boston? Is it part of that, rich history of the streetcar suburb, or is it actually, taking it too far?
Yeah, this is really just embracing that history. The transportation system that we need in the future actually looks a lot like the one we had around 1900 or 1910 in Greater Boston, where people had lots of options for how they would get around, whether it was walking, biking, taking transit, or driving, or in that case, taking a horse if you go that far back. But people had good options. And we've really worn down those options over time. There are fewer reliable bus lines, fewer reliable subway lines, and certainly fewer reliable streetcar lines than there were back then. What this act is trying to accomplish, I think, ultimately, is trying to address a major pain point for families in Massachusetts, which is that it's so expensive to live and stay here. And the two most expensive parts of any family's budget are housing and transportation. For some of those families, the cost of those two items is 50, 60, 70% of their monthly budget goes to those two things. If what this act will allow people to do is live a little bit closer to transit, have more housing supply, which should help bring down or at least stop the crazy increases in housing costs, and then maybe allow them to go from a two-car household to a one-car household. That can save them $8,000 a year by doing that. And getting a T-Pass instead. You still have access to a car, you still have one car in your family, but you're saving $8,000 because maybe one of the members of your family is commuting by MBTA. In an era of inflation, in an era when so many people's budgets are stretched thin, this act is getting at that core problem. And it's not going to change overnight, but it's absolutely the direction that we have to move in.
So obviously there are some people that will always say, this doesn't go far enough. One thing about, the MBTA Communities Act is that it asks towns to rezone, but there's no requirement for new construction. So this is just one step of the process. After Brookline passes this, how can you make sure that developers come in and actually do increase the density in Brookline?
Well, look, we know that housing doesn't change overnight. I live in a house that was built in 1918, right? So it's been around for over 100 years at this point, as are most of the houses that are on my block. One of the great things about housing is that when you build it, it can last for a really long time. And we need to get started on being a state that builds more housing like we used to in, up until really the 1960s and 70s. So Brookline is required to zone for 7,000 additional housing units as part of this act. And again, communities across Massachusetts have similar requirements. In Cohasset, I think it's like 700 units. In Watertown, it's 1,700 units. That might sound like a lot of units, but it's just saying that the zoning must allow that. It's not saying that those units are going to show up on day one. It doesn't even mean those units are going to show up on day 10 or year 10 or the third or fourth decade of this law. It's just saying let's allow zoning that, again, is consistent with that historical character that we've seen in those communities. Just to put a finer point on this, it is legal in Brookline today to build a single-family home essentially anywhere across the entire town, and it is illegal to build a triple-decker basically anywhere across the entire town. And then we sort of scratch our heads and we say, well, why is housing so expensive? It's because our zoning dictates more expensive forms of housing. Again, what this act is, I would say, allowing or permitting or encouraging Brookline to do is reform that so it can be a little bit more accessible to everybody.
So just to close this out, one concern that I heard from some opponents was that the state hasn't given the towns enough time to comply or come up with a long-term planning effort. What do you say to those concerns? Has Brookline had enough time to come up with a thorough zoning plan?
We've had decades to reform our housing, and we've mostly chosen not to do it. The state passed this law in January of 2021. Everyone saw that this was coming, so we've had a good 2 years now to get this right. The plan that the planning department in Brookline has put forward has been through countless public meetings. It's been shaped by that public input, by the select board, by the various committees that form town government in Brookline. So this is the right plan at the right time, and it's the right thing to do, and that's why I hope that it'll pass.
Great. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Chris, Dempsey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.